This is a video that when playing the game, I was very excited and nervous to write the script. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker was the third 3D Zelda game, and was being looked upon at the time as the true successor to Ocarina of Time, as Majora's Mask was too far of a departure from the Zelda formula. Growing up, I had never heard of this game, and was more familiar with the sequel on the DS, Phantom Hourglass. Around 2013 was when I got my first and only ever Apple product, an iPod, and started to actually access the internet. I remember spending days just looking up videos of my favorite video games and watching funny people play them for my tiny little brain. But while I was searching for those games, I came across a Zelda game for my favorite console that I had never heard of, The Wind Waker. I did a bunch of research on this game, thinking it looked so damn cool. I'd been saving up all this money for about a year or so and had enough for the game. I begged my mom to take me to our nearest game store, one I still frequent today actually, to buy this game. When I arrived, there was the game, sitting behind a glass case. Along with it was a GameCube copy of Twilight Princess and a copy of Super Mario Sunshine. My brain raced at the sight of such cool games and which one to bring home and play for hours and hours and hours of my time. But when push came to shove, I decided I wanted the new Zelda game I had never heard of, and bought my $35 copy of The Wind Waker, which in fact I still own to this day. I had finally owned my copy of The Wind Waker. I still remember getting home and racing to my GameCube to pop the disc in and play that game for hours until I was forced to go to sleep. Except I didn't. I put maybe 2 hours into it and ended up calling it for the day. The next day I put maybe an hour or so and then called it. I kept doing this until one day when around like the 2.5 hour mark, the game crashed and I lost all my progress because I hadn't saved. I was bored. I wasn't really liking it, so I decided to put it to the side, disappointed. A couple months later, I was sitting around looking for something to do when I came across my copy of The Wind Waker and decided to pick it up where I left off and told myself I would force myself to play this game and beat it. And, well, I never did. I got to the Triforce hunt and couldn't figure out what to do or how to progress, so I gave up once more to never touch the game again until this very video. So this is why I have been nervous and excited. I never beat this game before this video, and even now while writing this script, it feels great to finally say that I have beat every 3D Zelda game to completion, something I've never been able to say before. But what did I think of this elusive Zelda game? Well, let's find out as we dive deep into my retrospective of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. In Ocarina of Time, we talked about how the game developed a legend for many games and journeys to follow and expand upon. Well, Wind Waker is actually our first game that is going to go on with that point, so rejoice! It wasn't just nonsense after all. Or maybe it was and I'm still talking out of my ass, who knows. The game opens up with a beautiful opening that explains the events at the end of Ocarina of Time from the adult timeline. Link was sent back to the child timeline, so when Ganondorf was able to break free from the sacred realm, there was no one there to stop him. In a last-ditch effort, the goddesses decided to flood all of Hyrule to ensure that Ganondorf could not get his hands on all the pieces of the Triforce. Speaking of the goddesses real quick, there is something I haven't really put much attention on. The three goddesses, Flor, Din, and Nehru, aren't really touched on too often when it comes to these games, and can be seen as a deity that most praise and we never really see anything of from their end. Not super important now, but later on in the retrospectives, it'll come back as a talking point I'd like to talk about. Nevertheless, our game opens proper on Outset Island, with this version of Link, Mr. Chibi. Alright, so another diverging path right here off the bat, the art style. Back in 2003, this game's style was very strange, and many people felt super mixed on it. But as the years have progressed, people have become nothing but fond of it, stating that it is the best aging game in the series graphically. Now, while I cannot disagree with the aging part whatsoever, I personally prefer a different game that we will get to down the line with that art style. I know, so much foreshadowing in this one. I apologize for that. Now, when it comes to specifically the Wii U version, I'm not sure if I agree with the sentiments. See, back on the GameCube version, the game looked pretty damn good and a bit cartoony. I could see a show like that popping up on TV and not batting a single eye at it. However, when they were moving the game and up-resing it for the more powerful console, they seemed to have lost what made the original version look so timeless. To me, the Wii U version still looks really good, but doesn't hold a candle next to the original. Not only is the bloom completely out of whack in this version, constantly washing out a lot of the picture during the day cutscenes and even just when you're walking around, but the actual game itself doesn't really look cartoony to me anymore. When I look at these models in the game, they look fantastic, but more in like a clay model sort of way. This very subtle distinction where things feel more artificially 3D it now really bugs me, and I have a hard time putting into words why that is. Looking at them side by side, the GameCube looks more like someone actually hand drew the game and then had it popped up into this beautiful life, while the Wii U version looks more like someone playing with their action figures. Now don't get me wrong, scenes like the final fight with Ganondorf, going into the darker temples like the Earth Temple, and the undersea Hyrule look great in the higher resolution, but something about it all seems a lot more lifeless when comparing it to its predecessor. It's honestly a really small nitpick, but one I have with the game nonetheless. If anyone else has the same issue, please let me know. I'm really interested to see if anyone else thinks that about the GameCube version looks far more timeless than the Wii U version does, like myself. Either way, we've been here too long and need to get back to the plot we are hammering at. Link, today being his birthday, is now ready to partake in the legendary tradition that is wearing the garb of the late hero of time and learning the way of the sword. Link wants absolutely nothing to do with this whatsoever, linking to one of the greater themes at large, being the idea of legacy being cast upon you and those older being able to let go of the past, but we will open that can of words much later into this video. While talking to his sister, Link sees a woman fall onto the island and quickly goes to see if she is alright. After confirming her safety, Link's sister Aryll is then kidnapped by the very bird that dropped the woman, named Tetra, and flies off with no sign of stopping. Link then teams up with Tetra and her ragtag team of pirates to head towards the Forsaken Fortress to save his sister. After infiltrating and finding his sister, Link is quickly caught and tossed into the ocean. Waking up, Link finds himself in the presence of a talking boat, dubbing himself the King of Red Lions. After a history lesson from said boat, Link and the king head off to find the 3 goddess orbs in order to stop Ganondorf's evil plans and save his sister from his imprisonment. Wind Waker's story is a lot more lax when compared to both Ocarina and Majora's Masks, and I think that is one of Wind Waker's strongest attributes that it holds. In Ocarina of Time, Link was destined to do things he did and went forth to save Hyrule because it is what the legend needed him to do. There was a high stakes with the Gorons being captured, Zelda gone missing, Zora's domain being frozen over, that Link, and by extension the player, were forced to have placed upon their shoulders. Majora's Mask is debatably even heavier in that aspect. The idea that the moon is falling and going to kill everyone, and that aside from that, everyone has their life-altering issues that need helping, and Link cannot do it all. Ocarina and Majora have a lot of urgency in their narratives, and Wind Waker has something of the sort, but it isn't nearly as big of a deal. See, Hyrule has already been flooded. The damage was done years ago, and people have already adapted to the way of life that it brought forth. Ganondorf has kidnapped these girls, this is true, and very early on Link fails his first attempt to save them. The game shows that they are safe, even if they need to be saved and brought back home. When talking to the King of Red Lions, he is more focused on Ganondorf and making sure they are able to stop him by any means necessary. However, the game never presents itself in a way that warrants the player to rush to get to Ganondorf. Wind Waker's biggest attributes that it forces onto the player, for better and for worse, is exploration. Or rather, exploration, with some decently sized quotation marks around said word. Yes, we are going to start with discussing the game's main appeal, sailing. Wind Waker's world is absolutely flooded with water, and with the King of Red Lions, the funny Waker that is sort of anticlimactically handed to Link, and the power of the winds, Link will travel all 49 blocks of sea to discover everything that the world, or this chunk of world, has to offer. Every block of the sea has one island that Link can explore. Some are a lot larger, such as Windfall Island, Dragonloose Island, the Forest Haven, and a few more, but the majority of these islands are on a smaller scale. Some just have a single entrance that leads directly to the reward that the island holds for Link. It is indisputable that Wind Waker gives you things to discover. Multiple islands with different gimmicks, with different characters to talk to, with different side quests to start and complete, and even some goodies to collect within the water itself, such as rupees, sea charts, and pieces of heart. Sea charts are what this game will reward the player for snooping around and finding the more hidden chests in the islands of the sea. These sea charts will give the player clues to find more important goodies, such as pieces of hearts. So now that we've explained how the world works, what do I think of it? Well, this is maybe my first issue with the game. Sailing is super boring to do. In previous games, there was a lot of dead space, that is for certain, but the player was able to manually walk there themselves, kill some enemies, find some hidden caves or something, and then get to the destination without realizing just how long it actually took. Majora's Mask definitely does a way better job at this than Ocarina, but in Ocarina, they give you warp songs on Epona to make travel a lot less tedious. In The Wind Waker, they decided to make the world a metric fuck-ton bigger than the previous game. They decided to keep the same amount of activities that the player is able to do and take out all the fluff between objectives. You will hop on your boat, change the direction of the wind, and then activate the sail and start your slow-ass journey. You move very slow when sailing in the water. There is a solution to this issue, but that has its own issues lined within it. You see, on Windfall Island and only during the night, so you will need to wait until after the first dungeon of the game to then sail back and learn the Song of Passing to turn the game to night, there is a bidding game that you can participate in to possibly win and earn a reward. There is a sea chart, a Sheik of Joy pendant, a piece of heart, and the Swift Sail, which changes the speed of the boat to a bit faster and makes it that the wind is always blowing to the back of Link on the water. The bidding game isn't very fun and it will cost you quite a pretty penny. If you end up doing what I did, bidding a piece of heart and then having damn near 0 rupees left, then your ass is going to have to either grind for rupees or do what I did and just push forward very slowly and get to it when your mandatory revisit. Or so that's what I thought. But then I had to come to the realization that the game will not let the player partake in the bidding minigame until after getting the 3rd orb. This doesn't seem like a huge issue all by itself. I understand that full and well. However, this isn't the first time Wind Waker did something like this to me. Wind Waker, to me, is full of these tiny little irritating things that build up so drastically and end up causing an overall bad time. This stupid bidding minigame, the awful stealth sequence with some more air conditions in the beginning of that game, the constant whiplash of progression across the sea the first half of the game consists of, and even more obtuse plot progression. Okay, so this next thing I have to say may be a bit of a hot take or something, and I am probably very in the minority on this one, but it's something that I faced in my playthrough, and since this video is about my experiences, I feel the need to share. Ocarina of Time had a lot of issues when it came to its plot progression. It would constantly have the player doing things that seemed nonsensical in order to get the game to push forward the main plot. Majora's Mask had a much better time in this category. The way you push forward never seemed obtuse due to the game's heavily emphasis on side quests and how important they were to not only the experience, but also to progression as a whole. Wind Waker, though not at all close to Ocarina in its obtuse plot progression, sort of hit some of those same Ocarina notes for me when I was playing. Firstly, after you complete the Tower of the Gods, the King of Red Lions tells Link that he is going to need to complete 2 temples, the Earth and the Wind Temple, and find all 8 pieces of the Triforce of Courage, something we will get into very soon, don't you worry, my friends, in order to go forward and defeat Ganondorf. At this point in time, I hadn't explored much of the left side of the map. Everything that I needed to go was in the middle, and I sort of was just seeing everything in the middle of each destination. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to progress. After exploring a bunch, I gave up and looked up where I was supposed to go. They told me I needed to warp to this specific location on the map in order to get the flame and ice arrows from the Great Fairy. But I didn't have the fast travel in the game. This was something that you had to get lucky in running into the large fish guy in the part of the sea and get lucky that you had enough arrows to take him down, although it does only take something around like 2 or 3, so that isn't a huge deal. The fact that this required thing that I needed was just sitting in a random spot of the ocean sort of ticked me off, but I decided not to think much of it. But then I got to the Triforce Hunt, and that is when everything just started to really piss me off in this game. The first island I got to for the Triforce piece was this strange island with these high-sitting birds and some seagulls flying around. It took me a while, but I finally figured out I needed to use the pear I bought from the beetle a while back. I used it to control the seagull, but I was quickly killed by the birds I neglected to get rid of beforehand. My fault. However, what wasn't my fault was that I only had 1 pair, but there was no beetle shop nearby. I needed to drive to the nearest beetle shop to grab some more pairs. It is a minor inconvenience, but once again, this game has so many irritating things that stack upon each other. Or how about this one? Early on, Link can play hide and seek with this gang of punks in order to get them into school. After doing so, the teacher will ask Link for 20 joy pendants for a special gift. As a player, I saw this as an optional piece of heart or something that I could get for exploring more and finding these joy pendants that they wanted. I kept it in the back of my head as I progressed through the game, but never gave it a ton of thought until I needed to. I made it to the island Oasis, and the game wouldn't let me in because the guy inside wanted the owner to come back. That's fine, but how do I get in? There were no signs that the island had a secret entrance, or someone I needed to go talk to, or where this owner of the caverna was. After faffing about for a good while and getting the other more obvious pieces of Triforce, I decided to cave and looked up how I was supposed to get the piece that I was missing. What I found was shocking. That Joy Pendant side quest that I decided to give up on, because by the time I thought about going I only had 13 pendants, was all of a sudden mandatory, meaning I needed to go to the 7th Labyrinth, just to grind for joy pendants in order to have enough to give to the teacher who is apparently connected to this random cavana on the island oasis, all in order to get a small piece of a larger Triforce. This shit is so dumb, and I was audibly groaning at the screen as I did all this, irritated beyond belief. But then that wasn't even my last Triforce piece. You see, there is on the map this little ghost ship off the grid that doesn't really tell you anything about it. Now, this one may be my fault for the way I played through this game, not exploring every little corner of the world, but I will focus on why I did that tiny bit later on. But from where I was at the game, I had no hints on where to go for this. What I was supposed to do was find this island on a specific grid tile that I hadn't explored at all to find the ghost ship chart that would show me where the ship is. This was the icing on the cake for me, as this ship was the kind of thing that I do not like in video games, and is the sole reason why I reluctantly saw the flaws of Ocarina and realized that the game isn't nearly as approachable today as it was back in its time. Wind Waker's biggest issue is easily the reason why they really want you to play this game: the exploration. Looking at games from around the same time, one example, it could be something like Metroid Prime, another Nintendo product. Open world or more exploratory gaming was something that games had already been dabbling in as much as they could, and the examples like Metroid Prime, they were doing fairly well in this category. However, the exploration of Wind Waker is really slow and boring. You spend more time slowly moving in the water and actually seeing new and cool things to interact with. All the interesting NPCs with quests to progress are mitigated to these 2 or 3 islands, which is baffling to me. Why would they make all these islands in the game to only populate very few of them? You barely ever see anything on these other islands except maybe one NPC that is part of a different multiple islands quest, which gets irritating really quickly. We might as well start talking about the side content at this point, as it goes segue rather nicely. Before we get to Wind Waker's side quests, let's review the side content for the previous 2 games. It'll be important to my standpoint on Wind Waker's content. Ocarina of Time did not have a lot of good side quests. Some of them were great, such as the Big Goron side quests and the Gerudo training grounds. Most, however, were not as nice, such as Bombchu Bowling, the Deku Song in the Woods, the Poe Hunting in Hyrule Field, and a bunch more. Ocarina of Time, for every good side quest, has maybe 4 or 5 side quests that are either boring or extremely aggravating. Majora's Mask had it a lot better when it came to side content, and maybe this is because it was the main focus of the game, but they were nonetheless. Majora's Mask was able to make a majority of its side content very entertaining. Not only, though, were the things you were doing very fun to get done, but it also was able to take the people that the side quests revolved around and made them a lot more involved, making for a more narrative-driven aspect to the side content, which, if you know me, you know I much prefer that sort of thing in games. Now, why bring up these 2 games that we've already discussed? Well, because Wind Waker somehow falls right in the middle of these 2 games, but sadly tends to lean more towards Ocarina in terms of quality. The side content in Wind Waker takes a huge hit due to the new system brought into the game: spoils. Spoils are an item that enemies have a chance to drop. Weaker ones will drop joy pendants, bird-like items will drop feathers, dark nuts will drop champion belts, and other enemies will drop a few more different types of materials for Link to collect. I'm just going to come right out and say that this system is nothing but a hindrance to the game. Unless you know that you can use the grappling hook to consistently get these items out of the enemies, you will have to get lucky enough for these items to drop frequently enough to then use them in the retrospective quests. What these items essentially do is pad the quests out and make it so that the player must essentially go and grind in order to get enough pieces to get the reward. Some of these quests will even make it so that after you give the reward, you still need to do even more for the reward. For example, giving the champion's belt to Orca allows Link to partake in the minigame for the super spin attack. Giving the joy pendants to the teacher will give you the title deed that then allows you to enter the island oasis for the Triforce piece. This addition of the joy pendants is really baffling to me and why they even added it at all. The game doesn't really give the player much of an incentive to collect these, as the boring process heavily outweighs the actual use of the reward you will obtain after all the grinding that would be required. But aside from these shitty quests, how do the rest of the quests fare in the game? Not super well, I'm sorry to say. This gliding game with the Deku Leaf is really neat. I never got to finish it as I didn't find the mana upgrade, but I would have loved to finish it if I had. This minigame is great, but if I'm being honest, it's the only good one I can really think of. There is a minigame where you need to travel all over the overworld, watering trees in a specific time frame. Shouldn't have to explain why that one is tedious and uninteresting. Another one has you trading items with two specific Gorons who move around the overworld. After 2 or 3 trades, you receive a purple crystal that allows Link to be impervious to damage at the cost of rupee meter every time Link gets hit. The armor is neat and it's only 3, so that's not awful. Unless you want the piece of heart they give you at the end, which means you need to keep trading a metric fuck ton of times until you finally get another reward at the end of it all. The final minigame I want to mention is the battleship minigame. I love the host and how lifeless he seems at times, with him using the cardboard cutouts for the scenes and a smile never appearing on his face. It's quite charming and is something I'll get onto later with the characters in the game. However, once you start playing, you will no longer find him charming because his minigame is maybe one of the worst I've ever played in a Zelda game. It comes very close to Bombchu Bowling for me, and even fishing from Ocarina of Time. What you need to do in this game is battleship. You choose a tile on the grid, and if it hits, great. If it doesn't, try again. There are 3 ships that you're looking for, and you only get 20 hits to try and find them all. But not only do you need to find them all, you need to hit all parts of said ship, just like battleship. If you end up hitting a spot that the rest of the ship isn't at, well, congratulations, you just wasted a hit on something because you lost a 50-50. Not only that, but there are 3 ships and each one is a different size. One is 2 bits, one is 3 bits, and one is 4 bits. So if you don't know how big it is and guess it's bigger than it actually is, well, congratulations, you just wasted a shot. You are limited on shots, which makes sense, but you are too limited in what the game wants you to do with its trial and error bullshit. This is essentially my thesis on how I feel towards progression in the overworld, both optional and mandatory. Everything is simple but made extremely tedious due to stupid limitations and withholding of information. The game yearns for you to explore every single inch of the overworld and find every single secret. The issue lies that the overworld is very bland and boring and slow to traverse, and all the secrets you find are either pieces of hearts or rupees. I feel Wind Waker is far too ambitious for its own good. It begs the player to explore and find secrets. It wants you to feel like a pirate. However, the game fails to give incentive to do so, making everything in the open world feel so tired and draining to complete. A Zelda game isn't complete without its dungeons and the temples to dive into and complete, and Wind Waker has those, but not without issue as well. See, one thing to note is the rushed state of Wind Waker. Wind Waker was rushed for release and lacks obvious missing content that couldn't get finished. There are only 5 temples. Now, to be fair, Majora's Mask only had 4, and though that might have been due to similar issues, the way Majora's Mask presents itself, 4 works perfectly for the game's pacing. 5 for Wind Waker, especially when looking at it through the story, feels really rushed as a side effect of it actually being rushed in production. But just because it has a fewer than preferable doesn't mean they're bad. They could be the best dungeons of all the games yet, making up for the lacking content. They could be. But, well, they aren't even near that board. Let's begin with Dragon Roost Cavern. Now, technically this is and isn't the first dungeon of the game. You technically go to Forsaken Fortress first. However, the Forsaken Fortress is a complete stealth sequence that first of all is a slog to go through and extremely boring, but is also completely different from every single dungeon afterward, and even every sequence after, for the stealth in this area is completely abandoned after this. I am super ecstatic that it isn't in the game later on, but it is also very strange to introduce something so specific and then never get around to expanding upon it. Nevertheless, I don't count the Forsaken Fortress. Dragon Roost Cavern is the first dungeon that you come upon at Dragon Roost Island. It being the first dungeon, I'm not super disappointed with it being so linear and boring. The way the dungeon works, you essentially just walk in straight lines, and whenever you find a locked door, you can find a key just around the corner, and then progress further onto the straight line until the next roadblock. The item here is the grappling hook, which thank God it isn't a replacement for the hook shot. We'll see that later in the Wind Temple. The grappling hook itself is a pretty boring item that is only used whenever they feel like making you take another 10 seconds just to push forward, but it can also be used to snag items from enemies to gain the different spoils I mentioned earlier. The boss is Goma, who as always is beyond easy to beat, but once again, I'm not too bothered by it. Dragon Roost Cavern is a very decent starting dungeon, though a little bit on the easier side, but with it being the first gives it a lot of leeway from criticism. So, if the first dungeon is basic, surely expands upon it like the 2 previous games, right? Right? Nope. Not at all. The next dungeon is the Forbidden Woods, which I would dare to say is more linear and more boring when compared to Dragon Roost Cavern. Dragon Roost would have you do puzzles, with the largest air quotations there, to gain a key you needed. In the Forsaken Woods, you will just need to enter a room next to the locked room to fight an enemy or traverse some trial and error maze to then get the key. No matter how base level it is, Dragon Roost at least tried to have the player solving puzzles, while the Forsaken Woods just sort of lets Link push forward like a bulldozer. They try to show a line of progression with how to unlock doors, first starting with the nut, then needing the bombs, then needing the boomerang in order to open the door. The whole dungeon is linear hallways that doesn't allow the player to deviate from the path. Now, instead of going through the rest and explaining, I'm going to talk about the only exception to this rule, which is the Wind Temple. Now, real quick, I do really like the Earth Temple. I think it was really fun and is the only temple I actually had fun with in the Wind Waker. However, the Wind Temple is the only temple that has what made the Water Temple so great: the hub room. You need to examine the temple as a whole and see what rooms are still there to explore and how to get into them. It isn't nearly as fleshed out or as interesting as the Water Temple. Hell no, this temple is still way too easy. But it does try something, and whether it succeeds or not is a different question, because I don't think it really does, but the fact that it isn't a hallway temple in a game full of them is a point of praise to be given. The Tower of the Gods, the middlemost temple of the game, is in this strange sitting where the beginning is trying to trick you into thinking of an exploration-like progression, where it only has two rooms, one needing to be entered before the other, which then leads the player to the absolutely most egregious hallway temple in the game. This one hurts the most because not only does it trick you into thinking you're going into something interesting, but it also manages to be lesser than both the Dragon Roost Cavern and Forbidden Woods, and it comes right after both of them. The temples in this game got me so irritated, not only being so blatantly boring, but also the enemies found within are either pitiful or extremely frustrating to even get a hit on. Combat in the Zelda games is something I didn't go into much because I've always felt like it wasn't the main focus of the games. Combat to me was always added to not only make sense for the story, but also to mix in some action and different activities within the dungeons. Now, Wind Waker sought to mix up the combat and try to make it more in-depth and less mashy, which is honestly something I'm totally down for. An emphasis on combat for Zelda I think would work fantastically as long as it is done well. The issue is that Wind Waker's combat is lesser than both Ocarina and especially Majora's Mask. Ocarina has this issue with a few enemies, mostly the Stalfos, that would sit around for a little longer than ideal until they would attack the player. It isn't something that affects the grand scheme of things, but in Wind Waker, it is something that affects the pacing of progression as a whole. Every enemy, including some boss fights, are taken down in one of two ways. The first is classic fanfare for Zelda, which is mash the B button until the enemy falls. This is something that is in a ton of video games as a whole, and I don't give the game a lot of flack for. However, the second way enemies are hurt is by the command prompt attacks. Wind Waker has a system where as an enemy attacks, a prompt will appear on the screen that if the player presses fast enough, Link will enter a counterattack against the enemy. Now this idea is great, and for smaller enemies it's pretty fun. It's just a flashy little cinematic, but it's kind of fun when you get the timing done properly. The issue is that there are some enemies in this game that require you to wait until the enemy attacks so that you can counterattack them. That seems annoying, but whatever, Ocarina got away with it. But here's the thing. Some enemies will require you to get the timing on them multiple times in order to actually kill them. And not only that, but they will put multiple of these enemies on you at once, meaning you have to hope you're locking on to the right one that is going to hit first, otherwise you're getting hit because you can't counter an attack when you aren't focused on a specific enemy. This small tweak makes the combat in Wind Waker a slight step down and makes combat a little more tiresome, in turn making dungeons even more of a slog to try to trudge through. I don't want to keep hammering this in, but it needs to be known that even though the dungeons are pitiful to go through due to its linear design and boring items, I think it doesn't even come close to the lackluster design that is the overworld, and a large reason for my dread towards this game. If the overworld is bad and the dungeons are boring, what is there to enjoy in this game? What reasons are there to come back to this game? The stories and the characters, maybe? Well, let's finally get into that, shall we? Wind Waker's charm that it relishes in definitely carries into its characters and their designs, for sure. When people discuss how good the game looks, I think that character design is something that goes unnoticed. There are very few characters that look subtle in design, and everyone looks over the top in a good sense of the word. Link himself looks pretty great, but the villagers of Outset Island are where the design really takes hold. Errol and the rest of the residents have this old town feeling that makes the island feel more isolated in comparison to the town like Windfall. Everyone looks a lot more formulaic here, which is more boring but definitely fits in its more bustling city feel that it's going for. The Kokiri and the Rito tribes have a more fantastical feeling, and the Rito especially I love. These cool-ass birds that stand apart from the other races in Zelda. The characters themselves, however, vary in degrees of entertaining or not. Link himself in this game is fantastic, not my personal favorite, but when people tell me that he is the best incarnation, I cannot disagree. He is super expressive and has somewhat of a hidden personality. He loves his sister, and you can tell just by his face when he feels sad, angry, happy, very confused, which is pretty often, and all this just culminates into the most expressive and personalized of the Links, which I appreciate immensely. I've never liked the silent protagonist that a lot of the games go for, and Zelda is no different about it. However, Wind Waker probably comes the closest to giving Link his own personality, which I really appreciate. Some other great characters in the game include Medley and Makar, which are pretty great in their respective areas. Makar is this small, jolly tree fellow that is kind of a little shit, but always means well, and Medley is this sweet girl that just wants Kamali and her people to thrive the best they can. Personalities are great for characters, but it's after their base characteristics that we start to see it all crack. Wind Waker loves to introduce characters that have vibrant personalities. However, it doesn't like to do is expand upon those ideas and actually develop characters, even at a base level. You see, characters back in Ocarina of Time weren't ever very deep. I noted issues I had with Zelda and Saria specifically, but not only do I think that did help with a bit of the Legend-esque feel that the game was going for, but they did go through tiny changes, if ever so little. Majora's Mask then took the next step forward and gave its characters arcs. Still not super huge arcs, but you saw development. There was the Deku King learning not to be so hasty. There was Kafei and Anju who were trying to be together and fully realized their love by the end, with their masks and all. There is a Gorman troop leader whose band performance is cancelled, and Link helps him cope with his dour feelings. Majora's Mask was the next step towards making the world feel a lot more personal with its characters, and yet Wind Waker decides to take 2 steps back in terms of characters. Let's start with Medley and Makar. Both of them are seen twice throughout the game, with the 2 dungeons that take place in their respective areas. When you meet them at first, you learn about them at the basic level. So when you go back to their areas in order to teach them of their duty in the world, you expect some hesitancy or some realizations or something to show that these characters are real people. People who think about things that they are told. However, the game decides to put them in a dreamscape with their ancestor and just accept that their duty is to push forward and do Link's bidding. Why is there no contemplation or consideration about what it is they're being asked to do? Why do they just accept everything that they're told to do? This is maybe at its worst with Tetra. Tetra, for the first third of the game, is a fantastic character. She has this rough exterior pirate feel that she gives off, showing she doesn't give a shit about anyone except herself. They don't show enough of her whatsoever, but the very few times we do see her, she is fantastic. We see her slightly show her more generous side when that she tries to hide from Link a few times, most notably by letting him steal the bombs from the pirate ship. There is a moment, however, where you take Tetra to the underwater Hyrule Castle to meet with the late King of Hyrule, who tells Tetra of her ancestry to the royal family, with her being the long-forgotten Princess Zelda. A very obvious but cool twist that I do like. What I don't like about it, though, is the fact that Tetra, the self-sufficient pirate who takes nothing from no one, just accepts this fact and sits in the castle like a damsel in distress to be kidnapped by Ganondorf. I highly doubt that someone in Tetra's shoes would take this as fact and just accept the role of a sitting princess. It is super hard to believe and very irritating. Why is it that every character in this game just accepts their role that they are supposed to have in the world as a whole? Even Ocarina of Time showed more personality, and its characters accepted the fact with the sages better, with hesitancy and reluctance before realizing that it was for the greater good. It was shallow, but there. Wind Waker's characters feel extremely rushed, and I know it's not the first time I've said that before in this video. The story of the Wind Waker is nothing special, but does have more of an overarching narrative than the likes of both Ocarina and Majora. Wind Waker expands upon the legend of Ocarina, but in a way that is more about breaking the mold, being true to yourself and not just listening and doing things because that's what people of history tell us to do. The King of Red Lions pushes people to do what he feels needs to be done, trying to bring back the world that was in his time before. The King and Ganondorf both resemble the same world of before, but 2 different sides of the coin. The King realizes at the end of the journey, no progression in the realization by the way, it just kind of comes out of nowhere, that he was being selfish and pushing his ideals and whatnot onto the children of the future, and pushes Link and Tetra to carve their own world and their own ideals. While the King has his moment, Ganondorf is stuck in the past, reminiscing on what he has lost and what he wants back. Ganondorf is great in this game, but I do wish we got more of him. He is trying to gain back the Triforce so we can bring back the world that was, with him in control of it all. He still keeps his ideals from Ocarina, which is cool, but has expanded upon them with time. Ganondorf has actual depth, but sadly is the character with the most personality in this game. Wind Waker's characters are pretty tragic in the way of depth, and only have charm in their appearance. Wind Waker is a game that I think I enjoyed playing, but have very little want to go back and play. There is a New Game Plus mode that allows you to keep the Outsa outfit, which I love and I wish I could have chosen from the beginning, but think it's a really cool bonus for completing the game nonetheless. There are a few things I haven't really gone much into, like the bosses, some of the items you obtain, and others. However, I feel you can probably guess on how I feel about it all. Underwhelming and rushed. I think that both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Masks are better games than Wind Waker, but I can see what there is to love about this game. It is extremely charming and lovely to look at. Sadly, I think this game lacks a lot of the depth seen in Ocarina, and especially Majora, that made those games so fun to explore and even replay. Wind Waker at times felt like a chore to complete, which is never good for a video game to feel like. There are plenty of ideas that I could see being fantastic, but the game lacks the polish to bring such ideas to fruition. I think that Wind Waker as a whole is a step backward for Zelda, which is a shame. It is a perfectly fine game, and when I hear people say they love it, I think I understand why. But for me, it just feels so lacking, so incomplete. I really wanted to like this game, add it to my pantheon of Zelda games that I praise and push on to others. But alas, here I am, left feeling incomplete about the whole experience. Wind Waker just isn't for me, and that is truly a shame.